All right, ready to talk ogres?
Always. It's a topic that never gets old, does it?
No, not at all. These creatures have been around for centuries, in myths and legends, even popping up in modern stories. It makes you wonder, what is it about these figures that just stick with us?
I think they tap into something primal, that fear of the monstrous. And the history of ogres goes way back.
It does, to even just the word ogre itself. It's believed to be connected to the Etruscan god, Orcus.
Yeah. Orcus. Not a very pleasant deity. I mean, he was associated with the underworld and, he was believed to have a taste for human flesh.
Intense. So that really sets the stage for how we tend to think of ogres, like large, menacing, not exactly the friendly neighbor type.
No, not at all.
And I think the first time we actually see the word ogre appear is in the 12th century in a romance by Chrétien de Troyes. He mentions the realms of Logre, referring to it as a former land of ogres.
That reference to Logres is really interesting. It ties into early British history and mythology, suggesting that ogres were already part of those narratives way back then.
Like they were woven into the fabric of their world. And from there, the word itself kind of spread and evolved. In Italian, you have orco.
Right, and some scholars think that these words might actually be connected to even older concepts, maybe originating from a shared Indo-European mythological root. For instance, you have the epic poem Beowulf. There's this word in it, Orkneys, and it refers to these monstrous creatures. And some scholars even connect that to Tolkien's orcs, although it's a bit debated.
It's interesting to think about, though, how these ideas travel across time and cultures. But I think the way we really think of the ogre today, with all those classic characteristics, I think that really came into focus with the French fairy tales.
Definitely. Writers like Charles Perrault and Marie-Catherine D'Aulnoy, they really played a huge role in shaping how we view ogres today.
Perrault's the one who introduced the term ogress, right, in Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah, and then D'Aulnoy gave us ogre for the offspring. They really built out the whole ogre family tree.
They did. And it's in those French fairy tales that we see a lot of those now familiar ogre traits really solidifying, the size, the menace, and very often that appetite for human flesh.
Right, they really cemented that image.
And that brings us to some of the most well-known ogres in literature and folklore. Who can forget about the ogre in Puss in Boots or the one from Hop on My Thumb?
Classics.
They really are. But it's interesting because, while those stories specifically label those characters as ogres, there are other figures in folklore and mythology that share a lot of those same characteristics, wouldn't you say?
Oh, definitely. It's like they embody that same, I guess you could say, monstrous archetype, but they just aren't explicitly called ogres.
Exactly.
Like take Bluebeard, for example, or even the Beast from Beauty and the Beast.
Oh, yeah. They might not have the ogre label, but there's something very ogre-ish about them.
For sure.
And what about giants? Like in Jack and the Beanstalk. I mean, they're huge, they're powerful, they're often menacing. They kind of give off that same vibe, don't they?
They absolutely do. And if we look even further back to, figures like Polyphemus, the Cyclops from the Odyssey, or the Jotun from Norse mythology, I mean, it really suggests that this archetype, this powerful, often monstrous figure, is something that appears all over the world across different cultures. It's really ingrained in human storytelling. The ogre is really just, one version of a much broader idea.
So it's not necessarily just about the name ogre then, but more about this underlying idea that it represents.
Exactly.
This idea that, has shown up across cultures and throughout history.
And it's one that continues to resonate with us even today. So we were talking about how, this idea of the ogre, it kind of goes beyond just a specific name. It's really tapping into this broader archetype, this monstrous figure. And it makes you wonder, why has this idea stuck around for so long? What is it about ogres that just resonates with us?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think part of it might be how ogres are often connected to nature, to the wild, untamed parts of the world.
Absolutely. I mean, think about where you typically find an ogre in a story, right? It's always these dense forests, secluded mountains, shadowy caves. It's where nature is really in control, where civilization feels far away.
It's like the ogre's domain.
It is. And that setting reinforces this idea that the ogre is somehow connected to this raw power of nature. Like they embody those aspects of nature that we both admire and fear. That unpredictability, that sense of, both creation and destruction.
Right. So it's not just the monstrous, but also the power and mystery of the natural world that they represent.
I think so. And, if we want to go even further with that thought, maybe ogres also represent our own primal instincts, those urges that we have deep down that we try to suppress in a civilized society.
I like that because ogres are often driven by these very basic desires: hunger, greed, wanting to protect their territory. These are all things that we experience as humans, right? But we learn how to, I guess, regulate them, channel them in ways that are more socially acceptable.
Exactly. So maybe ogres give us this glimpse into what could happen if we let those primal instincts just run wild. What if we abandoned all those rules and just went back to those baser urges? I don't know. It's kind of a scary thought, but it's also kind of exciting, isn't it?
It is. There's something, well, something alluring about that idea of the wild side. But most of us stay on that civilized path, thankfully.
Right, of course. But the fact that we're still drawn to these stories, that we still find them so captivating, I think it means that, there's something about that connection to our primal selves that really intrigues us, even if it makes us a little nervous at the same time.
So how do we reconcile those two sides then? The civilized side and the primal side. Are they always at odds?
Hmm, that's a good question. Maybe it's not so much a battle, but more like a balancing act. Maybe it's not about getting rid of those primal urges altogether, but more about understanding them, recognizing that they have power, but not letting them completely control us. It's a tough balance to find for sure.
It is. And I think these stories about ogres, these creatures who are sort of in between, they're not fully human, not fully monster, they can help us explore those ideas. They remind us that we're complex beings,
Yeah.
capable of both great good and, well, terrible things too.
That's a great point. And maybe by understanding those darker impulses, those parts of ourselves that we'd rather not think about, maybe that helps us understand what it means to be human a little bit better.
Okay, so we've talked about how ogres embody this archetype of the monster, how they connect to nature, and how they might even reflect our own primal instincts. But it's also really fascinating how the way we see ogres has changed over time, don't you think?
Absolutely. The way we portray them in stories has definitely evolved, and I think that reflects how our own values and understanding of the world have shifted as well.
Right. In those traditional fairy tales, ogres are almost always just straight up villains, like they're pure evil, end of story. But in more modern stories, we're starting to see a lot more complexity.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Like, look at Shrek, for example. I mean, he still has those classic ogre qualities. He's big, green, a little scary looking, but he's also a good guy. He's funny, he's kind, and he ends up being the hero.
He totally flips the script on what we expect from an ogre. And I
Yeah.
think that's a big part of why people love him so much. He shows us that even those who look monstrous, they can be good, even heroic.
I agree. Shrek challenged those assumptions we have, and in doing so, he kind of became this pop culture icon. He showed us that you can't judge a book by its cover, and that even ogres deserve a chance.
Right. And even when ogres stay the bad guys in stories, they're not always one-dimensional anymore. We get to see their motivations, their backstories. There's a depth there that you don't always find in those older tales.
Yeah, for sure. Like in the Spiderwick Chronicles, right? Mulgarath, the ogre. He's a powerful and dangerous villain, no doubt, but there's a reason behind his actions. He's trying to protect his people and their traditions.
It's more than just being bad for the sake of being bad.
Exactly. He believes in what he's doing, even if we might not agree with his methods.
It's a good reminder that even those we call monsters, well, they have their own reasons for doing what they do.
Exactly.
So the ogre, this figure that has been around for centuries, it kind of gives us this way to look at some really complicated questions, don't you think? Like, what does it mean to be good or evil? What motivates us? What makes someone a monster in the first place?
It's a powerful concept, and I think that speaks to why these stories have endured for so long. They still have something to teach us.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the mythological roots of ogres to their more modern roles in stories. But I feel like there's still so much more to explore.
Oh, absolutely. I think it would be really interesting to take a closer look at some specific examples. How have ogres been portrayed in different forms of media? From those classic fairy tales to modern movies and TV shows, it's like we could see how this archetype has really adapted and changed to fit different stories and different times.
Okay, so we've been talking about how this idea of the ogre has really resonated with people for centuries. And now I'm really excited to kind of dig into some specific examples to see how this whole archetype has shown up in popular culture. Like, let's start with those, those classic fairy tales, because that's where ogres really take center stage, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Fairy tales are a great place to see those, I guess, those traditional portrayals of the ogre, often as like the big bad, the ultimate threat, like the embodiment of danger, especially to children. And those ogre castles, they almost become this symbolic place,
Oh, but totally.
like this place of fear and where rules don't apply. It's like a transgression of boundaries.
Yeah, yeah, like those castles represent like the unknown, the places where things are different, where the rules of society don't quite reach. And it's always the children who seem most vulnerable in those settings. But even then, even in those really traditional fairy tales, there's this element of cleverness, like outsmarting the ogre.
For sure. Like, think about Puss in Boots, for example. I mean, the ogre isn't defeated by, by being stronger, but by wit, by trickery. It suggests that even these creatures, these really imposing creatures, they can be overcome if you're smart enough.
It's a good reminder that brains can be just as strong as muscles.
Right.
But, we see ogres popping up beyond just those traditional fairy tale. Like we see them in more, I guess, modern fantasy.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons, for example, it's really made the ogre like a staple creature in that whole world, the world of fantasy gaming.
And in those games, they're often shown as strong, but not very smart,
Right, right.
which, can make them, I guess, formidable, but also kind of comical.
Yeah.
But then you have other examples, like in the Spider Chronicles, where Mulgrath, the ogre, he's a much more well-rounded character. He's not just a mindless brute.
Exactly. Mulgaroth, he's driven by this desire to protect his people, his heritage, and it makes him a more compelling villain because it's not just pure evil,
There's some depth there. It's like his actions are coming from a real place.
Exactly.
And then of course we have to talk about, we have to talk about the ogre who changed everything.
Shrek.
What a phenomenon he was. He has those classic ogre looks, big, green, a little bit intimidating, but he's good. He's funny, he's lovable. He's the hero.
He's the ultimate underdog, and I think that's why people connected with him so much because he really challenges those old ideas about what an ogre's supposed to be. I agree. I think Shrek showed us that it's okay to be different, to embrace what makes you stand out. It's like he's living proof that even those who seem monstrous on the outside can have good hearts.
So I guess as we wrap up this whole exploration of ogres, it's kind of clear that they're so much more than just, monsters in the dark. They can be scary villains, yeah, but they can also be these complex characters. They can even be the heroes.
Yeah, they really do reflect the full spectrum. They touch on our fears, our desires, our capacity for good and bad.
And the stories about them, whether it's an ancient myth or a modern movie, they keep drawing us in. Maybe because they force us to look at our own complexities a little bit. What makes a monster, what makes a hero, and maybe those lines aren't always so clear.
Right, right. And maybe there's even a little bit of the ogre in all of us. Something to think about.